Depending on where you're joining from today, thank you for joining today's live stream, which is a weekly live stream that I host every Tuesday at the same time. We cover things related to digital transformation, all different types of topics related to digital and business transformation, really. Um, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients reach the third stage of their digital transformation journeys. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment, but before I do, a couple of logistical things. The topic today is the future of supply chain and logistics, which I'm super excited to talk about because it's such an interesting topic to begin with. Plus, in today's day and age, in the last couple of years, it's become even more interesting and more just a lot more challenges in the space. So, we're really excited to introduce our guest here to discuss that here in just a moment. Secondly, if you could, we're watching the chat streams to all the platforming too, which includes LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So if you do have any comments or questions along the way, please feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those, and we'll get to your audience questions as well. And speaking of audience questions or engagement or comments, I would love to hear where everyone's joining from today. So if you wouldn't mind, just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from, because we tend to get people from all over the world, and it's super interesting to see where everyone is in this global digital transformation community that we're reaching every week. One last thing, this interview becomes part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So you're getting to see sort of the live production here, which this will be the sort of the centerpiece interview for our next episode of that podcast that comes out a week from tomorrow. So you're sort of getting to see how the sausage is made here by being part of this conversation here today. So thank you all for being here. So, all that being said, enough about me. Let's talk about our guest. I'm excited to introduce our guest here, Blythe Brumleve, owner of Digital Dispatch. Blythe, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And you pronounced all of that correctly, which is very rare for people who interview me. I know my name is challenging.
I usually mispronounce names all the time, so I'm just glad I dodged that bullet here today. Well, thank you for being here. It's great to have you on the show. This is the first time you and I have chatted in a podcast format like this. So really excited perspective and get your perspective on supply chain and logistics, which is something that you touch on a daily basis. But before I get into my questions and any questions from the audience, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background, sort of how you came up in this space, and also what Digital Dispatch does.
Sure. So my name is Blythe Brumleve. I have been working in logistics and supply chain for gosh, a little more than 12 years or about 12 years now. I got started as an executive assistant working at a 3PL, an asset-based 3PL in Jacksonville, Florida, here in the States. And at the same day that I started that job, I also started a sports and entertainment blog. So I was a former waitress that kind of got recruited to go into the logistics field, knowing that I wouldn't have to sit at a desk all day. And so my biggest thing is I didn't want to sit at a desk all day. And here I am sitting at a desk all day. But my boss was a former truck driver who worked his way up in that company and bought out the rest of the ownership, became the sole owner of that company. And when he found out about my little side hustle with a sports and entertainment blog, he said, well, why don't you start doing that for us? And so I was handed the keys of the website development, design, and marketing initiatives for $140 million logistics company. And I had really no idea what I was doing. This was really early on in the social media days. Twitter had just launched. I believe Instagram had just launched or was right around the corner from launching. We were also very new or very early adopters to the HubSpot methodology of inbound marketing, which I was really passionate about. I've never been big on cold calling or cold emailing. Those always felt like, sort of the easy ways to get leads and to get, qualified business. And so during our HubSpot initiative, that's when we were the second logistics company ever on the HubSpot platform. So this is like
Hmm.
2009, 2010, very early on in those days. So I worked for that company for about 5 years. Unfortunately, considering an asset-based company, that was also during the Great Recession. So during the recession, during the downturn, unfortunately, that company ended up closing down after 5 years, which was super heartbreaking. And then, so that sort of put me in a position to almost be like at a fork in a road and either choose to stay in this industry or to expand out. I chose to expand out. I went to media side of things. So I worked for a magazine, worked for a radio station, local TV, did all of those things mainly in the sports and entertainment sector. So then I went back after a few years because, frankly, sports and entertainment, money just isn't really there unless you make it super big. So I didn't really see it as a long-term career trajectory for me. So then that led me to go back into freight. That's kind of the funny thing about working in, logistics and the freight world is that it always finds a way to sort of pull you back in. So I went back to work in freight and quickly realized that I needed to launch my own agency, that, I needed to be able to call the shots and, make the decisions on where I think we needed to invest according to the attention economy. And so that evolved into starting a different podcast, starting, video networking, not video networking or video creation that leads to digital networking. And then now I do it full time for myself for the business over at Digital Dispatch. So I help other freight companies build a better website. And then on the other end, I also now host a show called Cyberly for Freight Waves that appears every Thursday at 2 p.m. So I kind of get to blend both of those worlds and get to talk to, cool people like you and, meet all the rad people in the chat. And really, I think that's the beauty of the industry that we work in is that, we're connecting the components of the components all throughout the world. And it's a new story every day. It's a new challenge every day. That's why I love this industry.
Yeah, yeah, it's very cool. It's a cool background too because it's not just a traditional supply chain and logistics background. That sports and entertainment piece that makes it interesting too. I imagine that somehow influences or informs the way you do your podcast and the other sorts of marketing type of stuff you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, I think for a long time, B2B marketing has been incredibly boring.
Mhm.
And when you really get into the niches of this industry, it's anything but boring. But that's all you see on the marketing side of things until, just recently, until, within the last couple of years, you're starting to see a brighter light being shined on the real work that we do, whether it's from, sourcing or procuring, different components or, trying to connect with a port over in Singapore. Like all of these things are just so cool. And now, we're just scratching the surface of highlighting those cool things that go on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got a ton of questions for you. You sort of touched on a lot of questions I'm going to ask you just in that little intro, though. So I appreciate that. That's super interesting. But before I sort of dive into these questions, I wanted to just turn to the audience really quickly and just look at where people are joining from today on the different platforms on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We have Jerry from Dallas, Brent from Calgary, someone from Atlanta, Oman, Colorado, Paris, France, India. Greetings from New Jersey, California, Italy, and just all over the place. Saudi Arabia and North Carolina and
That's
India. I think
awesome.
by India. Yeah, so we're touching a pretty global audience here today. So thank you everyone for joining, especially those of you joining at strange times of the day for you or late in the evening. I appreciate you being here today. Um, so I guess just to start, I thought this would be a great sort of 20,000 foot flyover starting point for us, and then we can sort of dive into your background and your experience with supply chain and logistics in a little bit more detail. But if we just sort of back up and look at um, what is logistics? I mean, just help us understand. Maybe we kind of know what it is, or we've heard the term, but just maybe help us understand what is logistics and how does it fit into supply chain management in general.
Sure. So supply chain is essentially bringing all of the components that you need together to build a product, build a solution, and then ship those items from port to porch. I heard that phrase recently, and I just love it, from port to porch. So the supply chain is that greater initiative of bringing all of those components together, the component of the component. But then logistics is the transportation management. So whether it's land, sea, air, also the storage of those goods, so warehousing, that logistics is really the transport of those goods to get them where they need to be. It may be, you need to get them to the business or you need to get them to the consumer, but the logistics is the transfer of those goods from point A to point B.
Gotcha. Okay. So so supply chain is everything really, from getting raw materials to the manufacturing, warehousing. The port to porch part of it is within that, and then so we're kind of focusing within the logistics space in that port to porch space. And I hadn't
Yeah,
heard that either. Great,
Well,
great
yeah,
term.
it's such a great phrase that I'm like, "Oh gosh, I hope that," I went and looked and to see if that website was actually taken, and it is. So unfortunately, I could not claim it.
Oh,
So
no.
shout out to the person who did create it. But I think, for a lot of folks, they just see the goods around them and, they never really paid attention to how they actually got to where they're at. And if you look around your room, which is something that, a maritime is a perfect example of this, where maritime shipping, 90% of all of your goods, if you look around the room right now that you're in, 90% of those goods were shipped on a cargo ship. And so for us to think about the complexities of how to get your product into a storage facility, and then from that storage facility to a container, and then that container onto a ship, and then the ship to, another side of the globe, and then to unload it and to transport it to another storage facility, and then that storage facility gets transferred to another distribution facility. It's an incredible amount of work and software that is all involved in this process. But at the end of the day, it's still a lot of these transportation, solutions that we have been using for hundreds of years, whether it's, transporting these goods by a ship or by a boat, or even some of the river systems, that canvas throughout the entire world. It's just so much going on that comes together in order to get the stuff that we need to, buy off Amazon or to buy off of another provider and get it shipped to us in 2 days. There's a lot of things that go on during that process.
Yeah, and things certainly have not gotten any easier with the pandemic and the disruptions and bottlenecks to supply chains that happened as a result. What are some of the ways that the logistics space has evolved in recent years, either just strategically and or in response to some of the impacts of COVID and the related supply chain impacts?
So I think of this in two ways. I think from the technology aspect, that's a huge one. For the majority of the time that this industry has been operating, it's been, sheets that we manually fill out. It's a bill of lading that someone physically prints out, someone physically signs, and then that bill of lading goes from one part of the world to the other. That part of the process has not changed, but the technology that's come into this space, and I think the data sharing that's gone on is incredible to see. And we're really only, I mentioned, earlier, we're only kind of scratching the surface on, on the content side of things, but on the technology side of things, especially from data sharing, I think that we are really only scratching the surface. Being able to, save, 0.5% on the cost of shipment for your goods is an incredible savings, and technology can give you that. And when you're talking about, maybe like a percentage point or even a half a percentage point of savings, think about a giant cargo ship. It's if they have making, maybe $2.7 billion in revenue for the year, that 0.5% is a lot of money that you can save just simply by adopting new technology, data sharing between different companies, allowing, third party vendors to, have access to that data. I think is another advancement that I really never thought that would come to fruition. I still think a lot of companies are scared to share their data because it is, proprietary to their company. But on the flip side, the amount of benefits that you can get simply by data sharing, I think is incredible. And we're only really scratching the surface. Another big area that I think has changed is that the ability to network in a digital environment first. When COVID hit, that was because if you think about it, a lot of our connections that we made were made, going to trade shows, going to events, going to conferences. And when COVID happened, that just dried up instantly. And so we were forced to change our networking habits from the things that we were used to an entirely new environment. So you've seen the growth, and you can see, all the people in the chat right now that are coming in from LinkedIn. LinkedIn is one in particular that just exploded as far as, network conversations that you can have. You can have a digital handshake with somebody from across the world and then be able to eventually meet them at a conference, later on, obviously, when things, sort of settle down from, the COVID experience. But nowadays it's really quite remarkable to see that, Apple and Spotify, they don't even technically have a supply chain category in like their podcast or even like a, a subcategory under business, but we still feel like there's is so much content that's coming out of these platforms. I saw a list the other day that now there are top 75 influencers in supply chain list. There's a top 60, a supply chain podcast list. These things did not exist 2 years ago. And a lot of those podcasts, honestly, are not very active anymore. But the amount of activity that we've seen since then has been just a dramatic increase. The knowledge base of sharing of information is so crucial to this industry. We talked about, data connections and data sharing, but also the information and the knowledge base and the experience sharing that's happening on social media, I think is another just it's something that the industry has needed for quite a long time. And I'm glad to see it coming to fruition.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting how, once you start hearing politicians and mainstream media start talking about supply chain management, that's when you know it's sort of it's a fairly big deal. And it was, I remember right when the pandemic hit and just hearing politicians and people on TV talk about supply chains. I'm like, wow, I've never heard. You never hear anyone talk about supply
Right.
chains. It was almost weird. So it's good that it's become front and center. And then more recently, it's become front and center um, in a less positive way, I guess you'd say, in terms of people concerned about the supply chain, and rightfully so. What do you think? How do you think organizations are going to adjust to this new reality, or whatever you want to call it? Even though I hate that term, the new reality. How are organizations going to respond? How do you think they'll evolve their supply chains and their logistics function within that to sort of adjust to this new world we're in?
So I would say that for a lot of folks, adjusting to the communication aspect has been very challenging for them. These are folks who have never been used to being on camera, not used to doing something like this, where we're going on live and we're talking about industry issues and how can we solve these complex problems. So I think that for a lot of organizations, becoming comfortable with being on camera, executives becoming comfortable talking about, not just what's going on in their company, but the news that they may see out in the world, maybe it's on freightwaves, maybe it's on, some other, inbound logistics, some of these other, supply chain focused media companies, maybe they see something there and they don't agree with it. Being comfortable sharing their opinions, not just in a boardroom, but in an online environment. I think that that is still, if you are an executive in this space right now and you're not doing that, you are missing out on a gold mine opportunity, because that is the quickest way and the most efficient way to have, these digital platforms work for you and sell for you and market for you 24/7. We can't, that as think for a lot of folks, we can't, we're doing this live stream for about an hour today, but afterwards what happens with this live stream? You're going to take it, you're going to put it on a podcast. You maybe will take it and use social media clips to put out to your social media network. That kind of content works for you 24/7. And so I think for a lot of companies, adapting to that evolving business model, learning the technology that you have to use, not just to keep your business running, but also to keep the messaging running, I think is going to be one of the bigger challenges that a lot of companies are still just very challenged by. They don't see the investment in it quite yet, but the ones that have over the last couple of years, they are reaping the rewards, because the recruiting is getting easier, retention is getting easier, the ability to communicate with their team. They're probably, for a lot of companies, they might not be full time back into the office yet, but it's an ability to, enhance those digital communications and supplement that communication until you're able to meet in person. I think too, we mentioned as far earlier with as far as like the adoption of, new technology. And with adoption of new technology, I think that's another thing that's a big challenge for a lot of companies, is that they see a lot of, they're sort of I guess, guilty of falling for like the shiny object syndrome, where they see like a shiny new piece of software, but they have no idea how the in the trenches employees are using software and getting the job done today. So I think that, it's great that we have all of this technology coming into the space, but how are you using that technology to make the end user, or not really the end customer, of course, is going to benefit from it, but the end user who is actually using it on a day-to-day basis, I think there's definitely some room or some room for improvement that needs to be made there. And, to try to avoid that shiny object syndrome, where you're just going to buy a piece of software and think it solves all of your problems, when, in a variety of different industries and aspects, that's just it's not the right way to look at it.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear your marketing slant, and I know that's your focus is marketing, but marketing within logistics. To your point earlier, having that kind of focus and that sort of a spotlight on the marketing opportunities for logistics companies. That's just something that hasn't been that common in the space because, like you said, B2B marketing has traditionally been pretty stale. When you compare it to B2C and what some of the big consumer product companies do. So that's pretty interesting. One question I wanted to ask you that is actually not my question, so I will not take credit for it, but it's a really good one. It's from Sam Graham. Welcome back to the show, Sam. He's a regular, frequent contributor to our show from Spain, and he says, "Will reshoring lead customers to expect shorter delivery times, and will that lead to new logistics challenges?" So maybe just explain what reshoring is first of all. Second of all, is that trend towards more reshoring and maybe even bigger picture? It's not. It's also the sort of nationalism that seems to be spreading throughout much of the world that I imagine is probably impacting the supply chain as well. But how do you see that whole reshoring? What is that reshoring concept, and how do you see it impacting logistics and supply chain?
So for reshoring, particularly when it comes to the US, because with the US, it's we've spent years, offloading our manufacturing process to other countries. And when you have a situation like that, you realize how quickly it can become a national emergency. I'll use Puerto Rico as an example because Puerto Rico, I think, manufactures 90% of the world's IV bags. And when they were hit by a hurricane, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was Hurricane Maria. When they were hit by Hurricane Maria, they all of the world's IV bags were the supply chain was just it just collapsed within a matter of days. And so I think what you're seeing is not only reshoring and bringing the manufacturing closer to the US, but also the distribution of it. The idea that you can have the world's largest supply, 90% of IV bags being manufactured in Puerto Rico. The world needs access to those. And so I think that you don't even realize it until an emergency has happened. And so when you have an emergency come up like that, and also, obviously with what we've experienced with COVID, now there is that financial incentive. I think for a lot of businesses, they see a situation like what happened in Puerto Rico and they say, well, that's only going to happen, once every handful of years. That's not something that we really need to be, worried about over the long term, where we need to make these massive investments to bring reshoring back over to, say, the United States or even, in Mexico, which is a big winner post COVID. That's where I think a lot of the opportunities are now being made, is that you're realizing a lot of these business owners, they're being given, the government realizes it first of all. So they're giving incentives to these companies in order to bring reshoring back to where it makes the most sense, where you can reduce those lead times, where semiconductors is one of the perfect ones right now. Having the world supply of semiconductor chips being made in Taiwan has worked well for a very long time, but all it takes is one global incident and that is shut off. You can't use your phones, you can't buy new phones, you can't buy new computers. Cars are sitting off in the lot, not being able to be driven off the lot because they don't have, this one component of a component. And so that's where I think a lot of these businesses are now, they're realizing the national security issue that arises from not having multiple distribution or multiple manufacturing spots, multiple distribution spots, and being able to diversify. If you were going to war, you wouldn't have all of your warships in one port. You would diversify them because you learned after Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, we had the majority of our, naval and air fleet all located in one area, and all it took was one strike and you're wiped out. So I think that you're starting to see a lot of these businesses. I think it started with the government being able to offer these incentives to these business owners to bring some of that business back to the States. So now you're seeing semiconductor chips or manufacturing plants going up, I think in Texas and Ohio, here in the
Hmm.
States. You're seeing more manufacturing return to Mexico and being built up in Mexico rather than, China and Vietnam. So it's a really fascinating sort of evolution of what it took to get the government to realize these issues, to create the incentives to make these businesses move their operations back because they were making plenty of money in these other countries. What's the incentive to bring them back? So you have to, sort of, it's these complex solutions to these complex problems. And thankfully the government has started to recognize that and given these other companies the incentives to capitalize on capitalism, I guess is probably the right word.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting, and I didn't realize that about Pearl Harbor. So I got a little bit of a history lesson in there too. I didn't realize that was a problem logistically with having all the fleets in one spot like that. And it is a good analogy or a good comparison to what you have to think about with supply chain too. Um, and I think too, I know one of the laws that the United States just recently passed, the U.S. government, I believe, was to partially to invest in chip manufacturing in the U.S., knowing that we're too dependent potentially on other countries and there were shortages, and so it is interesting to see the government get more involved, not just in talking about supply chain management now, but now taking a more active role, for better or for worse, taking a more active role in sort of making sure that we're making these investments in supply chains and really diversifying, which is super interesting. One of the other things you mentioned, I think, was a really important one. You talk about how we spent years and years building this global supply chain, and it really started what in the '80s, maybe or '80s and '90s. It seems like is where it really started. The pendulum started to shift toward that whole global supply chain aspect with big companies like Walmart. I know being a big retailer, they sort of perfected supply chain management back in the '90s, and other organizations followed suit. So it's a really interesting point you make that you have, say, 30 years of this global supply chain that was built, and in a blink of an eye, it's totally disrupted, and you're sort of rethinking that whole thing and trying to adjust. Do you think companies are just how would you assess companies in their success so far in adjusting to what they need to be doing to be more effective in that environment?
So I think one of the cooler stories that we saw coming out of the pandemic is, I mean, it's not really cool that a lot of these ships, a lot of these cargo ships are, waiting. They're at berth off of, say, the port of LA, for example. I think that they have at the peak, they had somewhere like close to 70 ships that were off the port of off the West Coast ports, which is the port of LA, Oakland, and then Long Beach. And so you had these situations where the waiting time was anywhere from 24 days to up to 60 days in order to unload a cargo ship. And when you think about that process of unloading, even when you arrive at port, then you have to take about anywhere from 4 to 5 days in order to offload that cargo ship. And whereas, compared to the rest of the world, I think they can get it done. I think China can get it done in a day at the port of Shanghai. There are other automated ports all across the or not the United States, but across the world that have, port automation. And so they can unload a cargo ship within a couple of days. But the US is still largely behind when it comes to the automation aspect of ports all across, whether it's the East Coast or the West Coast. And so what happens is during COVID, you saw some of these shippers. Home Depot, I think, was one of the first ones. They really just bought their own cargo ship because they couldn't find any space
Mm.
on all of the cargo ships that were leaving China. So they really they bought their own ship, and they put their own products on it, and then they transported all the way around, sometimes to the East Coast, in order to offload that cargo. Another interesting one was Amazon. They bought their own cargo ships as well, and instead of trying to wait it out on the West Coast, they just rerouted all of their ships that they just purchased and rerouted them over into the Gulf of Mexico. And I just think that that is incredibly fascinating to think about it. Not just because manufacturing, of course, is going to it's happening right now. Those chess pieces are being set up both in the United States and in Mexico and in South America as well. But those take years to build those facilities. What in the more immediate near future, and what's really already happened, is that these ships are tired of waiting for the space on the cargo ship, because it's really come to find out, it's really who in order to, or what kind of price you're willing to pay in order to get onto one of these cargo ships. I heard, I think it's Nathan Strang from Flexport. He said the other day that a lot of these cargo ships operate like a Disney World or a Disneyland, where you have, your certain access points where you pay your admission fee, and you can get on whenever you can get on the ride whenever you want to get on the ride. But then you can pay a little extra and get a fast pass. Or you can do a single rider line. So it's kind of an interesting comparison to think about how all of these major US retailers were just struggling with not only finding containers, finding pallets, finding cargo ships, and how they've really adopted their own internal transportation methods in order to optimize their own transportation process. Because I think it's somewhere up like 40, 45% of a company's revenue is all just a company's costs of doing business is all related to transportation costs. So if you can control it, you can get it down. You can get your shipments where they need to go, which is probably more important right now, is making sure that you can actually get the product and get it where it needs to go. That's where we're seeing a lot of retailers focus. And I think that, the purchasing of your own ship was one of the more fascinating things to come out of COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. And that whole vertical integration, for lack of a better word, it seems like a lot of organizations are sort of bringing a lot of their supply chain functions in house, and that's another part of the pendulum swinging or kind of going the opposite direction now compared to the past, where in the past it was all about outsourcing and finding the best 3PL provider and other third party providers that can help with your supply chain. But now it seems like the pendulum sort of swinging back to where we need to control it. We want to invest in our own supply chain capabilities, which I find super interesting. We have a client actually that has, you might find this interesting. We have a manufacturing client that was having so much trouble finding pallets to ship their product that they went out and bought a pallet manufacturer. And it was that important to them, and it was that disruptive to their business to not be able to get pallets when they needed it. And the types of pallets, it's a custom product, so they had certain types of criteria they needed for their pallets. I just found that interesting. Like, you just wouldn't have heard that 3 years ago. I feel like that just, it was such a pretty eye opening moment for me when we saw that from our client.
Right, because I mean, I think about it from because I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, and so there's parts of Jacksonville. I think you can probably say this for a lot of areas of the globe. There's parts of areas of town where it's a big city, but then you just drive, 30 minutes in one direction, and it's all countryside. In that countryside, these pallets are typically used for bonfires. So people would have parties and bring in all these pallets and burn. They were free. Stores couldn't give them away, and they're just throwing them outside by the dumpster, and then they become this crazy commodity where I think the craziest price I heard was like thousands of dollars for one pallet. And I'm like, gosh, imagine
Wow.
being in the pallet business. So that's a great story that they just went out and just bought a pallet company.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know, like, if they're selling the pallets to their competitors or if they've sort of closed it off to where it's just for themselves. I think they're still
It would be smart if
running
they
it.
did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, have premium pricing to your competitors. Um, well, good. So there was another question I wanted to pull up here that I thought was interesting. I lost it here. Bear with me. I lost it here. The good news is we're getting a lot of questions. The bad news
Yeah,
is
it's a
that,
lot of good questions.
yeah. Um, let me ask you this. I don't want to put you too much on the spot if this isn't an area that you have a good answer for. If you don't, I'll try to take a stab at it. This is from Kyler, who's actually our podcast host, listening in the background here. She asked, when we talk about new tech and logistics, how have you seen best of breed solutions evolve in supply chain management? So, in other words,
Oh.
rather than being dependent on like your traditional old school ERP systems to sort of manage everything for an organization, are you seeing supply chain technologies, sort of those focused supply chain technologies that specialize just in that? Um, do you think that is that sort of a trend you're seeing, or do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a really good question and a little outside of my wheelhouse because I really have I guess a more awareness around what the freight companies are using, maritime companies are using. So it's not really and maybe that's where you could maybe help shed some light on this because from a global supply chain perspective, from the logistics perspective, it's really about these companies. You have a TMS, so a transportation management software. You have a WMS, a warehouse management software. You even have, yard management softwares and things like that. But a lot of these different platforms, they are really trying to be a lot of things. And I could speak from like the marketing and sales perspective because a lot of these platforms claim they have, good marketing and sales components to them. A lot of them are crap. And I have no problem saying that because I've worked in these platforms myself. It's been a few years since I've been, elbows deep in a lot of these different solutions, but a lot of them from the people I talk to, they don't talk well to each other. And I'm assuming that that exists a lot in supply chain management as well, because in the logistics area, it would be incredibly difficult to find a WMS that is also a really good TMS and or a TMS that also has a really good YMS component. They're either building it themselves and then just shutting everything else off around them. So there were two technologies that came into the space, I would say probably about 10 years ago, because the ELD mandates came through for a lot of truck drivers. You have to have these electronic logs that are built into the trucks. So a lot of different technology solutions were building for ELDs. And instead, what they should have probably been building for is API integrations. And so API integrations, for folks who don't know, is just basically a stream of data of how you program your own data. So then that way you can plug and play with other data solutions. API integrations, I feel like, are only just, another, I guess, thing we're only scratching the surface of what these API components can do. Because, from my experience, I've worked in home building, I've worked in, obviously with, sports and entertainment and things like that, where the data connections are just so seamless. And in this space, they're not seamless. You really have to really have a team of skilled developers. And that's primarily what I'm seeing now, is that a lot of the bigger logistics companies on the freight side of things, they are really investing heavily into where you were lucky 10 years ago to have a developer on staff in-house. Now these companies are having 10, 20, 30 developers all within the building that can be able to create solutions on the fly, and they are building their own their own API integrations for their own software, and then kind of shutting everyone else out. So they're building their own silos. So as if silos didn't already exist, in the transportation space, where you have, port workers that are going on strike, warehouse workers that don't want to work 24/7, truck drivers who don't want to work 24/7. There's all those individual silos. We're still seeing those in the technology space as well. But with the adoption, or the more so adoption of API technologies, I think we're going to see that stress alleviate a little bit, where there is more data sharing and there is more accurate, data sharing via API integrations. I would imagine that a lot of that is the same with supply chain software overall. But I would
Mhm.
love to hear, your experience on if those data communications exist.
Yeah, yeah, they do. They're definitely getting easier to have that data communication and that integration between systems. So having multiple systems that specialize in certain things that can't be everything to everyone, um, is a lot more reasonable today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So I think the good news is organizations have options. If you want to look for that one size fits all single solution that maybe doesn't do everything great, but it does do everything to some degree, you could go look at a traditional ERP system, or there's other options with what, like you mentioned, the warehouse management, the transportation management, the yard management, all these different systems that can specialize and do one thing really well. And this is actually another comment, sort of building on this, from Gassan on LinkedIn. He says the days of MRP could be on a decline. Forecasts are inaccurate, causing a cascading effect throughout the entire supply chain. ERP/MRP systems need to be more agile and provide a bit of intelligence to the end users. And I think that's well said. I think forecasting, and you kind of mentioned sales and marketing and how that ties into forecasting. Organizations generally need to do a better job of that. And I think that's the other thing, is that things were a lot more predictable before the pandemic. I think you could sort of, demand was more predictable, supply was more predictable, your trading partners were more predictable. You didn't have all these curveballs like ports, stuff, containers getting stuck on ports for weeks at a time, that sort of thing. So how do you think do you think technology can help solve a lot of those problems, like the challenges that you've talked about so far?
Yes, but I think it requires more collaboration. And I think, from not just from the people stand, or not just from the technology standpoint, from the people standpoint. Because what I see, especially at a lot of like the higher executive level, is that they are buying the fancy, the shiny object syndrome. They're buying the fancy software thinking it's going to solve all of their problems. But in reality, it's because they didn't have the conversation with the in the trenches employees, of the people who are using that software every day, that they didn't have that conversation ahead of time. They didn't have that, an implementation conversation with those. I'll use freight brokers for example. When we, as a company years ago, when we made the decision to switch TMS providers, it was frankly a shit show, and it was one of those things where the TMS did not have the capabilities to provide accounting data. The accounting department relies on, knowing which companies have really good credit, knowing which companies, that you can extend the billing date out, which companies that need to prepay, which companies that need to pay within 30 days. A lot of those components did not exist in this TMS. And so for a lot of folks, it just put a strain on the entire accounting department. The brokers who are actually using and booking the freight on the platform were just miserable. They went from booking something like 100 loads a day to a little over 40. And so that has a lot of downstream effects. And it was probably ultimately one of the decisions that led to the ultimate, collapse of the business. We were an asset-based company, and being an asset-based company, a lot of companies know, especially if you run trucks, that if you have a truck go down, that's a probably a $50,000 part. You're losing the revenue on that truck if it was running properly. So you're facing the downtime costs, you're facing the repair costs, and then you're not really using that to the best of your advantage. So for a lot of these different things, they can add up really quickly, and technology in the space is not cheap. And so when you're devoting a budget and a certain amount of time, I think that that's where a lot of the gaps are happening in this space, is that you're not talking to the folks who are actually going to be using the software before you make that purchase. And you need to know how your folks are getting the job done today and where it can be optimized. Because ultimately, if you do create that conversation and you have those conversations, then you know what steps in the process that you can actually optimize, that you can automate. A lot of times, these freight companies, they'll take somebody right fresh out of college, they'll sit them down at a desk and tell them to make 100 cold calls in a day. And that has been the business model, I think, for a lot of, talking about freight brokerages in particular here, but that's been the business model, I think, for a lot of these companies for years. And only now, with the adoption of more technology and the adoption of more communication strategies, are they now seeing the value and making sure that those all operate in a cohesive environment, in a circular environment. Because if they don't, then if one of those components goes down, it could be the detriment and could be the loss of your business.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's well said for sure. I wanted to pull up a comment here from Anders. Here it is, from Anders Green on LinkedIn. He says he can confirm we're still getting wood pallets all the time. Once we get up to 1 to 200, we post on Craigslist for folks to come and get them at no cost. At least 25% of them go to regular people who are doing bonfires or home projects. so,
Yes.
so if you need pallets, just look up Anders Green on LinkedIn and connect with him there. It sounds like he might be able to get you some pallets. So it's interesting to hear that data point or sort of validation of what we were talking about earlier.
I remember trying to, because we were doing an office remodel at one point, and we, in especially with a lot of these freight brokerage floors, the desk and the floor environment is really important to have a cool look to it. And so I proposed to my boss that we have pallet desk, and he laughed me out of the business. And I thought it would just
And
be so
by
cool, have different pallet stacks, and then you put a piece of glass on top of them. I didn't really quite think it through, if what the amount of times that brokers slam their phones down, I imagine that would probably be a mess. But I thought it looked really cool. So there's pallets are multifunctional. They can be furniture, they can be bonfire wood, they can ship your goods. There's a
yeah,
lot of things you can do with a pallet.
multi-purpose for sure, clearly, and bonfires, of course. And then this is an interesting comment from Sam Graham again, and actually, this I think points to an even bigger topic of discussion here. Maybe I'll spin this into a question. But Sam says some companies are forecasting demand at the wrong level of the bill of material, and companies are also sometimes stock at the wrong level. So they're forecasting at the wrong level, and so I think it sort of touches on really the sorts of changes that the supply chain and partners within the supply chain are going through in terms of technology, but also just rethinking how they do business and how they go about forecasting or how they go about building safety stock or whatever it is. I mean, I think companies have to really rethink their processes and the behaviors and the technologies that maybe challenge the status quo of how things had worked for those 30 years of smoothly running global supply chains. Now all of a sudden you have to kind of rethink some of those things. Is that something you're saying as well?
Yeah, because I think for a lot of companies, the supply chain, executive or the person in charge of managing the flow of your goods, never had a seat in the boardroom or never had a seat at the executive meeting each week. Now they have a seat at those meetings, and so they can share what they're finding and what they're seeing. Because, like I said, it affects up to 40% of your overall revenue is going towards transportation costs. So why wouldn't you try to find ways to optimize that process? And I think for a lot of these companies, what we're seeing now is that you have some of the smartest minds and some of the brightest minds that are trying to predict what consumer behavior is going to do. And in reality, we really don't know. We're 2 years, quote unquote, or really only even a few months removed from the biggest shakeup in our consumer behavior patterns. Are we working from home? Are we traveling? Are we flying more? Are we driving more? And so a lot of those consumer purchases that were made a year ago, a lot of those purchases are still sitting in, or not from the consumer side of things, but from the business side of things. A lot of those shipments are still sitting in a warehouse, waiting to be used. I think I read that last year, the container ships that were waiting to dock and waiting to come to port or come to call were sitting out there for so long that Halloween and Christmas shipments weren't being offloaded until January of this year. And so it's incredible to think about how all that merch has to go somewhere. So either you're liquidating it or you're storing it and waiting for this upcoming season. And so I think for a lot of companies, they're going to start, storage is already incredibly difficult to source and to find right now. So speaking from the United States perspective, but I think it's going to be interesting that after this holiday season, what those purchasing decisions look like, because we're still dealing with warehouses that are overfilled, stored to capacity, and what does that consumer purchasing behavior look like for this upcoming holiday season, especially as people are starting to get more out into the world, or maybe they're not getting back out into the world. Maybe they're trying to save money. Recession is here. So there's a lot of different things going on in the consumer area that some of the smartest people on the planet are trying to figure out where this is going, and we really have no idea because we're going off of unforeseen territory.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, makes total sense. And here's a question that I find interesting too. There's actually a couple questions sort of related to this one that have come from the audience. And this one is from Cha Cha on YouTube. Asks, I think the question was, can we predict uncertainties like port shutdowns, container load delays, etc.? And apparently, I think they had asked the question earlier and we didn't get to it. But what can organizations realistically, yeah, especially, and I guess here's where I struggle with supply chain management in general. Is you had sort of the extreme impact that the pandemic had on supply chain management a couple years ago, and now it's sort of settling into something more longer term. It seems like, but it's still changing. It's like you can't just respond and try to maybe overcorrect from what we needed 2 years ago, right when the pandemic first happened. But can organizations realistically start to? Do you see organizations getting a better handle on anticipating some of these disruptions a little bit better and using data and better processes or diversifying their vendor partners like you mentioned before? Are you seeing any of this have a material impact on organizations just getting better at anticipating those challenges?
Anticipating them is always going to be a challenge because of the way of the nature that the US supply chain is structured. I mentioned earlier that every aspect of our industry works in a silo. So you have, port workers on the West Coast that are unionized. You have a lot of the rail networks that are unionized. A lot of trucking companies are not unionized. A lot of warehouses are not unionized. I can't think of one, sort of off the top of my head. And so what you have is a situation where you're trying to predict things that, have unpredictable components to them. Whether there's the Port of Oakland that had their the drivers went on strike for at the Port of Oakland, and so none of the drivers are going in, and none of the owner operators are going in and out, but the port union workers or the port union drivers are still showing up to work. So you have a situation like that in particular where you maybe can predict that, hey, they're going to have a protest and they're going to shut down for a week. So that's up to you to be paying attention to the news, to be able to diversify your solutions, to diversify your different offerings. And what does that take? More networking, more communication. You have to communicate back to your customer of what the hell is just going on. And you're trying to figure it all out in a very small amount of time. So while we can, react, I think that that's where, the majority of this industry is evolving, is that we're trying to get to a proactive place, but none of the components really exist to make it as proactive as we would like.
Hmm.
So that's where the building the communications and diversifying your offerings really comes into play. I was interviewing with one woman who's a freight forwarder, and she was responsible for getting her customers' items into port and ultimately getting them from the port to the porch. And because of the backlog on the West Coast ports, she actually rerouted the entire shipment to a port in like northeastern Canada. And so that was obviously a little bit longer of a trek that her customer wanted to have for the shipment of goods. But ultimately, they ended up getting offloaded much quicker than if she were to just kind of wait it out on the West Coast. And so I think that those are, you have to be creative. You have to think outside of the box. Working in logistics and supply chain, you have to have your main ethos is to be a problem solver. And if you're not working to solve those problems, we can't forecast every problem that's going to arise. Ultimately, it's up to you to be able to build those different solutions and to see trends and to build those solutions based off of those trends. And if, XYZ happens at this port, which I think they might because they just passed this law, then we need to be able to have backup solutions in case, our freight needs to be moved to the East Coast or moved to the Gulf or moved to another part of the world.
Yeah, yeah, that's super interesting, and it reminds me of certain types of technology that's out there now that I've learned more about over the last couple of years, like technologies that'll help you collect data points, not internal supply chain data points, but macro and external data points about like the financial viability of a supply chain provider. Or you mentioned union versus non-unionized. It's fairly safe to assume that a union sort of shop might be a higher risk of disruption than one that's non-unionized. Certainly cost, we have always looked at cost and quality. I suppose that's always been a pretty common set of criteria, but that's still in there as well. That's more of that internal metric. But it seems like organizations now are having to be smarter about just thinking about where's the risk. Do we have too much concentration of risk geographically in an area where there's geopolitical risk or weather related risk, that sort of thing? It seems like we just need to get smarter as organizations and use the tools and data around us, maybe in different ways to really get a handle on being as accurate as possible in our forecasts.
And I think for a lot of these data tools too, it's not just, that they're a data solution. It's where are they getting their data from? Who are their data partners? A lot of these different solutions, they have to, especially from a data perspective, they have to partner with the companies that are actually moving the freight in order to get access to that data. And a lot of times these companies don't want to share their proprietary data. So you're operating off of a limited pool of sources. And then once you have that data, how do you make it actionable? And I think for a lot of companies, that's where the a bigger problem is starting to arise is that yes, we have all of these tools and these solutions and all of this data, but how do we make it actionable? How do we actually do something with all of the information that we have at hand? Because it's not just, as you mentioned, it's not just from the technology side of things, but it's also from geopolitical risk and what's going on in the world. We have to pay attention to all of these different news sources and then be able to act proactive, or I mean, I guess reactively, based on all of those different information points in order to be proactive for our customers.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's well said for sure. Um, what what so you touched on this a little bit, but maybe I'll ask it more explicitly so we can kind of focus on this thread a bit. But a lot of you've talked about how a lot of your focus with digital dispatch is on helping logistics providers market themselves more effectively. Why is this so important in the world of supply chain and logistics? Why is this focus on marketing? Why is that so important?
Well, really, you have the opportunity to be a big fish in a little pond. And it feels weird calling, supply chain and logistics, multi-trillion dollar industry that powers the entire globe. It feels weird calling that a small pond, right? But there
Right.
frankly just aren't that many people creating content in this industry specific to what your role and responsibilities and what your company provides. And so I think that there's just a massive opportunity, and we've kind of touched on this earlier, where a lot of these companies, they were reliant on going to the conferences, going to the trade shows, and being able to make those connections and have those conversations in a one-on-one environment. But now, with social media, for example, you have the opportunity to have a keynote speak or have a keynote opportunity to be able to speak on the topic that you are passionate about every single day, 24 hours a day, and it works for you 24 hours a day. And so what we're seeing now is more companies are starting to recognize the strength in talking about their businesses, the things that they care about that are, sort of adjacent to their business. All of these different aspects that, you would typically put on your website or you would typically put in a brochure and maybe talk about it at a conference. Now you have the ability to have that keynote stage every single day. And so only a limited amount of companies are actually partaking in this. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, especially as more media companies are growing in this space. And so when you have more media companies, you're getting asked to go on more podcasts, you're getting asked to go on more interviews, you're digesting more content from this space. And so if you're looking around and you're seeing what's going on, I mean, it just makes perfect sense to me of why you would need to want to be in front of that stage. You want to be on that stage. You want to be screaming from the mountaintop of the solutions that your business provides. And I just think that it's such an incredibly, I would say, slow to adopt in this industry. It's been a massive opportunity for a while now. It still is, and for the foreseeable future, as long as we're putting our attention online, there's an opportunity for you to capture that attention and ultimately, bring that person to become more aware about you as a person, what you care about, what your business problems solve. And then that way, when they come to the buying decision, they know who you are, they know the solutions that you provide, and they will come to you before they ever go search for a competitor in Google, before they ever send out an RFP. They come to you because they know what you stand for. Because at the end of the day, people do business with people, and we can have all of this technology and all this different functionality and all this data to sort of parse through. Can I trust you with my freight? That is the ultimate decision that people are making every single day of the week. Can I trust you that if stuff hits the fan, that you're going to figure out a way to problem solve it? And ultimately, social media gives you the advantage to be able to proclaim that message of how you handle difficulties, how you handle problems, and communicate that effectively to an audience that may not be ready to buy now and get your services now, but they will be over time, especially if you educate them over time. Anywhere from, I think a lot of folks, they try to get started on LinkedIn. I'm going to post every day on LinkedIn for 2 months. And then they quit LinkedIn after 2 months and 2 leads. And it's like, no, you're just barely getting started. Think about
Yeah.
it as, a content snowball effect, where if you consistently put your message out there, you are marketing yourself to 95% of the business world that isn't ready to buy. So that when they do become part of that 5% that they are ready to buy, you win before that person ever gets to Google. That's the ethos of sort of the communication strategy that I preach, that I follow myself, and that I help other companies refine and define. Um, and then it all really routes back to your website. Do you have a way to capture attention through social media? And then do you have a way to create that attention, create that demand for your skills and services on social media? And then do you have a way to capture that attention? So are you booking meetings on your site? Or do you have a way for people to request a quote, to contact you? I'm very, very passionate about building on land that you own. So your website, your podcast, your email list, and also land that you rent. So social media, for example. I think you have to have both of those in today's world. And there's only a small amount, a small percentage. I would say 5% maybe of companies, of supply chain and logistics companies, that are taking advantage of the everyday keynote that you can give. And I think 5% is being too generous.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a critical time for supply chain providers too, because it is a time where I think it's somewhat unprecedented, where you have a lot of organizations that are rethinking and replanning, redesigning their supply chains, which inherently suggests that there could be different partners or new partners entering the equation, that people are out there looking for alternatives to what is broken. And so it's a great opportunity for these organizations to be top of mind, when they are ready, when their customers are ready to make that sort of a decision, for sure. What so just sort of a capstone question, sort of tie this all together, everything we've talked about so far. What advice would you give to an organization that's about to embark on a supply chain improvement initiative? Like any kind of closing summary words of advice to an organization that's really trying to rethink their supply chain and being better at supply chain management?
I think that the most underutilized aspect of this would be having conversations with your customers. That is the driver of every other aspect, or should be the driver of every other aspect of your business. The kind of how you communicate to future prospects would rely off of those conversations with your customers, finding out those trigger points of what made them pick up the phone and call you, what made them come to your site and convert to become a lead. The conversations with your customers is something that I don't think happens. It happens a lot from a transactional standpoint. Where is my freight going? How, trying to source different components, procurement. A lot of those conversations are transactional in that sense, but they're not at a deeper level. How are you making the lives of your customers better on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? And then how can you take those conversations and then package them in a way that you can either use that insight, use that market research to communicate to other like-minded businesses that are in their same area or in their same field or commodity, and then using those conversations in order to market the rest of your business. Because from customer conversations, you can just really just drive so much more. And I'm not just talking about surveys, that you send out in an email and you have somebody fill out, a 20-question survey. Those are important for getting a massive amount of information, but prioritizing having, at least weekly conversations with your customers, maybe monthly if their time, is a little limited to have a weekly conversation, but having those separate conversations that are separate from the transactional conversations that you're having to go in on a much deeper level. And even, I mean, if you wanted to take it even a step further, having like a customer interview series where you turn that into content, and then you
Mm.
have that content and you have your customer on camera talking about how your solution helped them. That is a gold mine for your marketing. Now you know the exact verbiage of what your customer is using, not the jargon that you use day in and day out with your team and your employees, because for a lot of companies our jargon is foreign to them. You might as well be speaking a different language. But now, because of those customer conversations, the exact verbiage of what they're using. So then you can use that exact verbiage to talk to your other customers, to talk to your prospects, to convey that messaging in all of your marketing. It really has just an incredible downstream effect by simply having those in-depth conversations with your customers.
And I love how you gave an answer to my question, and then you tied it back to marketing. That was brilliant. So because it all ties back to, and you're right, it does tie together. It's a great idea if you're listening to your customers and learning what their needs are, and how you can build your supply chain in a way that's going to better meet the needs of the customers, and at the same time, while you're at it, creating marketing content that's going to allow you to market yourself to your potential customers. That's even better.
It's really firsthand market research, because a lot of this market research just doesn't exist unless maybe, trust the research reports that come out of like Gartner or McKinsey, those types of studies. But there's no better case study than talking to the people that you're already working with. I mean,
Yeah.
you're gonna drive so much value and so much information from those conversations, and the incredible downstream effects that it has will likely set your business up for success for years to come.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. Well, this has been a great conversation. I know we could go on, and maybe at some point we will. Well, maybe I'll have a part two of this conversation and go deeper into some of these topics. But really appreciate you being here today. How do people maybe just tell us one more time? How do we get a hold of you? What's your website? How do we connect with you? What's the best way to reach you?
Sure. So I'm a content creator in, supply chain and logistics space. So I have some projects that I work on, on the content side of things. But my main business is digitaldispatch.io. If you want to find, sort of just a list of all of my work, social media accounts, things like that, you can visit everythingislogistics.com. It's kind of like, for those folks who are familiar with like Linktree or, a site like that, I pretty much just built my own. And so everythingislogistics.com is where like all my social media handles are, the content projects I've worked on, and then of course, solutions at Digital Dispatch. And appreciate you inviting me on today. The discussion was awesome. The comments were great, and the questions were even better.
Yeah, and so many of them that we didn't get to too. I feel like we could do a
Yeah.
whole other episode just on the questions we didn't cover. So thank you to the audience too for the great questions. Apologies to those that we didn't get to all of your questions, but these are really good questions. And who knows, maybe we can take some of these questions and put out little clips of responses or
Yes.
something like that too. That'd be kind of cool. In the spirit of your marketing your marketing focus there too.
Yeah, this is
Well,
all
well,
great
thank
market research right
yeah. Speaking of listening to your customers, here you go.
here.
Well, good. Well, thanks for being here, Blythe. Really appreciate it. Thank you to the audience for being here today. Again, if you want to hear this complete episode of this podcast, we're going to produce it, edit it, all that good stuff, and it'll be released a week from tomorrow. And that podcast is called Transformation Ground Control. So be sure to subscribe to that if you don't already. You can also find it on YouTube, and I also post it to my LinkedIn account as well. So if you're on any of those platforms or any audio podcast platform too, you can find the podcast there as well. So thank you everyone for joining. Look for that podcast, and then we do these Tuesday. We do these digital transformation related live streams every Tuesday at the same time. So hope to see you here next week as well. And in the meantime, hope you all have a great week, and we will see you all soon. Take care.